Hi everyone, thanks very much for coming. I just wanted to say a couple of things before I start my talk proper. The first one is, this is going to be audio only. I am sitting as close as I can to the router in my house. I'm in my kitchen, but I can't get my computer to not fall over when I try and include the PowerPoint, so I'm sorry. And you have a handout, but you can just treat this as an audio presentation and look at the handout if you like. The other thing I wanted to say is I'm using the term queer a lot in this presentation, but it is something I have reservations about. And if you want to know more about what I think about that, I talk about it in my book, and you might want to have a look at the comments there. That was a really seamless book plug, wasn't it? So, to start, the womb is a controversial organ. It's long been central to arguments seeking to limit the definition of woman to the biological, or to limit her function to the reprosexual. An enduringly popular modern false etymology tells us that a woman is so called because she's a man with a womb, a wombed man. In a painful corollary to this valorization of gestational capacity, women whose bodies lack the natural capacity to gestate are implicitly not real women. Queer and feminist responses too often seek to discredit these arguments as out of date. But for a historian, of course, that only raises the question, when were these arguments in date? Do they have a history? And if so, what is it? For me, this question brought me to think about the medieval understanding of the womb and the ways in which the medieval womb might haunt more recent histories of gender and sexuality. So when I was invited to give this paper more than a year ago, I was bubbling over with examples of strange conceptions and weird wombs. I wanted to share Blake Gutt's amazing research into the male pregnancy of the apocryphal Saint Phanuel, who gestated the mother of the Virgin Mary in his thigh. I thought maybe I'd talk about Mary Magdalene, a sinner with a history of same-sex intimacies, who impregnates the Queen of France with a mere word. And I wanted to tell you about the pervasive anti-Semitic myth that Jewish men menstruated. I wanted to share with you the weird story about a Jewish doctor who appropriated the uterus of a Christian woman, performing a diabolical hysterectomy under the occult equivalent of general anesthesia. He kept the excised organ for his own nefarious purposes. I'm mentioning these anecdotes partly to pique your appetite for strangeness, of which there will be plenty, but I also wanted to give some sense of how closely the womb is linked to ideas of transgression, of unexpected bodies and uncanny events. The womb on which I will be concentrating, however, is none of these. It's the womb of the Virgin Mary. Now, Mary's womb is both exemplary and also generative in a profoundly strange way. It calls into question distinctions between organic and inorganic matter, between living flesh and dead stone. We will see that its operations disrupt time, breaking away from the normal cycles of gestation and birth. And perhaps most strangely for us as modern readers, Mary's womb is central to the representation of the Mother of God as somewhat masculine in her embodiment. So in the first part of this paper, I want to show how medieval writers and thinkers work to construct Mary's womb and Mary's gestational activity as peculiar, set apart from the norm. And one of my favourite aspects of this work is the growing medieval insistence on what we could call the paradox of inherited infertility. Mary comes from a long line of barren women. You may recall that in the Bible, it's Joseph, Mary's husband-to-be, who comes of the house and lineage of David. But medieval commentators wanted to construct a similar biblical lineage for Mary on the grounds that it was her human flesh that gave substance to Christ, and so it's important to know where that flesh came from. Accordingly, genealogies were written tracing Mary back to King David and connecting her with the line of Old Testament women who had been barren until God heard their prayers. As we said, Mary's maternal grandfather, St. Phanuel, appears nowhere close to the Bible, but the story of his miraculous male pregnancy circulated in popular collections of saints' legends. Phanuel's daughter, Anne, was widely understood to have been unable to bear a child. She's strongly associated with infertility. And her story is really constructed as a sort of mirror and repeat of the biblical account of Mary's cousin Elizabeth, who was barren until her old age. In each of these cases, it's only miraculous intervention that leads to a pregnancy, making Mary herself the last in a long line of women seemingly characterised by their inability to bear children. On the handout, I've given a fairly representative quotation voiced by an angel, no less, that sets out this barren lineage. Now, this emphasis on inherited infertility illustrates something crucial about discussions of sexuality in the Middle Ages. It's our tendency across the 20th century into the 21st century to defend queerness as natural, to point out that it's something that can be seen in nature and therefore should not be morally condemned. But to a world where human nature is understood to be fundamentally shaped by the fall, by original sin, to say something is natural is far more often to mean that it's corrupt, and specifically corrupt in a bodily and sexual sense. Now here I'm mainly paraphrasing Karma Lockery, but there's a big debate about this across medieval studies, and I'm sure in other fields of queer history too, so excuse me if it's all too well known. You can see though, that in writing Mary as the product of barren wombs, medieval commentators were insisting on her unnatural body. Her flesh, that will become Christ's flesh, is not the product of generations of ordinary procreative sex between men and women, but rather something more akin to divinely assisted fertility treatment. In a cycle of plays written probably sometime in the 15th century, there's a really nice explanation of the logic of this argument. The plays I'm talking about are known as the N-Town cycle, and we'll be returning to them. Describing Mary's imminent birth, one of the characters remarks that Mary shall be born of a barren body, so of her shall be born without nature Jesus. That is to say, Mary will be born from a barren body, and therefore Jesus will be born from her outside of nature, without natural causes, without natural help. So it's not chastity or saintly virtue that makes it possible for Christ to be born. It's barrenness and the removal from, or the sublimation of, natural reproduction. This idea of Mary's unnatural body shaped the way medieval thinkers and artists imagined the processes of conception and pregnancy. In good Galenic medical tradition, medieval medics and philosophers understood that the healthy female body was soft and liquid. By nature, women were leaky creatures, always ready to weep or bleed or lactate. This liquid porosity naturally made their bodies inferior to the more contained and controlled bodies of men, but it also allowed them to conceive. The logic was that, like liquid wax, a woman's womb needed to be soft and fluid in order to receive the impression of the masculine part at the moment of conception. And this metaphor of soft wax stamped with a masculine formative seal is ubiquitous, and it endures beyond the medieval. Within the womb itself, the liquid on which the growing fetus was nourished was understood to be essentially the same as the blood usually ejected from the body through menstruation. When a woman stopped menstruating, her womb filled with retained blood. In some cases, of course, this swollen belly might come to nothing, a gush of blood. The early months of pregnancy were not a time of certainty. It was thought that a fetus only gained animacy, only took on a soul, at the relatively late point, around 4 or 5 months in, when its movements began to be palpable. The fluids and bodily changes of pregnancy were associated equally with hope for a child and horror at the female body. Imagery of putrefaction and filth is common, and there's a graphic passage in one of the most popular medieval English texts, The Prick of Conscience, that refers to the fetus dwelling in filth and nourishing itself on foul glet and lipid blood, that is slime and clotted blood. All of this was destined to be very different for the Virgin Mary. Her pregnancy began not with intercourse, but with the Annunciation, the moment when God sent the angel Gabriel to announce to Mary that she should bear his son. This scene is one of the most ubiquitous in medieval visual culture, and its theology was tirelessly explored and explained. As Mary accepted the will of God, Christ became incarnate within her womb, without occasioning any bodily rupture or break. Such impregnation is visualized as akin to a beam of light, which can penetrate without breaking the window through which it shines, the glass through which it shines. A text attributed to Bernard de Clairvaux explained, "Just as the brilliance of the sun fills and penetrates a glass window without damaging it, and pierces its solid form with imperceptible subtlety, neither hurting it when entering nor destroying it when emerging, thus the word of God, the splendour of the Father, entered the virgin chamber, and then came forth from the closed womb." This metaphor of glass and sun was everywhere in late medieval English art and culture, requiring only the briefest mention to be understood. This image of in vitro conception metaphorically transforms Mary's womb from flesh to glass. The Virgin's womb is a space that is transparent in ways other natural wombs are not. This imagery of glass and transparency has to do not only with the idea of unbreakable chastity, but also with a reimagining of Marian flesh more generally. The concern to distinguish Mary's flesh from the flesh of other women is rooted in anxiety about her role as Christ's mother. So theologians describe Christ as being clothed in human flesh at the incarnation, clothed in the flesh of his mother. Since her flesh was identical with his, her flesh must also be represented as pure, sinless, perfect. And we'll come back to this idea of Mary's flesh as the clothing of Christ's humanity towards the end of this paper. As we've seen, ordinary wombs were soft and liquid, full of congealing blood or putrid fluid. By contrast, a long tradition of writers and artists imagined Mary's womb as being made of precious stones, not only glass, which was considered a stone, but also crystal, or in some cases gold. Some theologians argued that Mary did not menstruate, leaving her womb shining white or transparent. Others said she did not digest food in the ordinary way, leaving her belly empty and clear. Her womb is often, in these images, dislocated or made disproportionate. We'll see representations in which it's a crystal lozenge fixed slantwise in the abdomen, or a space that extends to erase and disembowel the Virgin's torso as it spreads from chin to navel. In some accounts, the Virgin gives birth through her side rather than her unmentionable genitalia. In others, the tiny fetal Christ is imagined entering her body through the ear as she hears the words of the angel Gabriel. Almost always, her womb is made not of flesh, but of inorganic substances. And we can trace this pattern from quite early in the medieval period. In the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen compares the Virgin's body to a shining gemstone and pictures her womb as a fount of medicine for mankind. A generation later, Caesarius of Heisterbach, who compiled a very popular collection of miracle stories, tells us of a woman who had a vision of the Virgin, all crystalline, as bright and transparent as a crystal, and in her womb, the most beautiful infant, crowned in the royal diadem. That is, her womb is so transparent you can see through to see the child. Later again, we have the visionaries Bridget of Sweden and Gertrude of Helfta, echoing the same imagery with an even more specific focus in on the womb. Gertrude writes that the Virgin womb was immaculate, as transparent as purest crystal, through which her internal organs, penetrated and filled with divinity, shone brightly. Bridget tells us that she saw the placenta or amniotic sac, what the Middle English translation will call the secondine, or the rim the child was lying in, and it was pure white. In material culture, these images come to life, literalizing the theology of the crystalline womb penetrated by light. There's a remarkable pair of statues known as the Katharinenthal statues. These are on your handout. They represent Mary and her cousin Elizabeth at the visitation, the meeting of the two women during their respective pregnancies. Both figures are represented in the classic pose, reaching out to touch each other's pregnant womb, and the wombs in question are represented by oblong pieces of rock crystal lodged in the abdomen of each female figure. Somewhat similar is the genre of moving statues known as Vierges Ouvrantes, or shrine madonnas. Now, these don't exist from medieval England anymore because they were destroyed at the Reformation. Several survive from elsewhere in Europe, and we know that they did exist in England. I've given an example of one of these on the handout. You can see that these statues are designed to open, usually at the torso, so that a cavity is revealed. Instead of a fetal Christ, the typical interior is painted and gilded with images of the Trinity or other scenes of Christian history. But there is a now lost statue known as Our Lady of Bolton, which was kept at Durham Cathedral in the late Middle Ages, and which apparently opened to reveal a smaller Christ statue hanging within the almost life-size womb of the Virgin. We're told the lady could be made to open from her breast downward, and within the said image was wrought and pictured the image of our Saviour, marvellously finely gilded, holding up his hands, and holding between his hands a fair and large crucifix of Christ, all of gold. Elena Gertzman, who has written the book on these statues, suggests that their moving parts, their capacity to move, enabled them to be used in religious performances. The fetal Christ could be lifted out of his mother's uterine cavity and then replaced within the womb once more. The statues represent the interior space of the Virgin not as crystal but as gold or painted space, and typically her body is hollowed out so she can contain these religious scenes. Her anatomy is not represented. This imagery and iconography is working really hard to separate the Virgin Mary's womb from the fleshliness of the ordinary female body. It replaces that fleshliness with material that's deeply imbued with symbolism. Mary's womb is actually constructed from the same substances that were used in childbirth medicine. Stones and gems were thought to have medical properties, and if ingested or held against the body, they could help shape and form a fetus, sustain a healthy pregnancy, prevent blood loss, and ease labour. And crystal, in particular, was associated with the liquid nourishment an infant required. It was thought to help women lactate. And because breast milk was thought to be basically another version of the same substance that fed the fetus prior to birth, we could see this crystal womb as a sort of sublimated, perfected replacement for those liquids that are not present in the Virgin's womb as they are in the wombs of ordinary women. Mary's womb is thus a sort of self-medicating womb, a womb whose ordinary fluids are transmuted into solidity in order to provide a constant source of self-regulating health. Now, Roisin Donohoe argued at GMS, and I was very grateful to her for her discussion there, that the stones associated with childbirth medicine are among those most responsive to human touch. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen and Valerie Allen have also published on this topic. These are stones that crackle with static, like amber, or become warm to the touch, like pearls and crystals. They behave as if they're imbued with responsiveness and power. And so you can see how this imagery of the Virgin's womb is incredibly evocative and incredibly transformative. The Virgin's womb troubles the boundaries between animate and inanimate, organic and inorganic material. And it's a kind of serious play that's very central to medieval Christian theology. We can relate it both to Eucharistic debates about the substance of the host, which is Christ's flesh, and the accident of that host, which is its visible form of bread. The logic of Mary's womb as crystalline stone also looks back to the Song of Songs representation of the bride. Glossed as the bride of Christ, and thus both the Church and the Virgin, Mary is both embodied and architectural. She's both the crystalline metaphor and the actual womb. And we can see then that these visionary descriptions and statues are literalizing metaphors already circulating in Christian theology and liturgy as they transform Mary's womb into crystal stone. They're playing with that distinction between substance and accident, in that Mary's body is made to become what it more truly is, the shining crystal or gemstone. Mary's body is emptied out of flesh, but filled up with symbolism that is a higher kind of truth. Yet, this saintly reproductive body also displaces the presumed feminine chastity of Mary with other more potentially troubling material that disrupts ideas about gender and sexuality. In Galenic medical theory, which dominates the Middle Ages and beyond, gender is understood to be cause and consequence of the balance of the four humours in the body. That is, the balance between cold and heat, wetness and dryness. Men are well balanced, of course, but relative to women, they're hotter and drier. This makes their bodies harder and less susceptible to the fluid porosity of liquids that spill out of women's bodies. And as I've already said, it's the fluidity of women's bodies that was understood to make them fertile. As we can see, the Virgin's body is imagined as mineral rather than liquid. It's made of hard, stony substances rather than soft, liquid ones. And I particularly love this in a just very simple, crude sense. Mary's generative parts are literally stones, and stones are the common and everyday euphemism for testicles. But aside from this enticing pun, there's something subtler going on, which we can understand with reference to lapidary theory. In his popular De Mineralibus, on stones, Albertus Magnus defines stone as a substance that's predominantly made up of earth. He includes in this category a lot of things that we wouldn't actually consider to be stones, and he explains how in different stones, this heavy ingredient of earth is mingled with other things to give the characteristic properties. Crystalline stones must be made out of wateriness, approaching airiness, which is hardened by the influence of earth into rock. The idea that a shining gem might be water turned into solid form is used to explain other stony substances. Both pearl and gold are understood to be liquid held in a solid state, the high luster indicating the high fluid content. And of course, gold was what's used to line those Virgin Grante statues. The whiteness that Bridget of Sweden associates with Mary's womb is probably meant to evoke pearl, the symbol of purity. So when artists represent Mary's womb as a hard, stony space made of crystal or set with gems, they are representing it as a space where feminine fluid has been transmuted into masculine hardness and elevated from something necrotic or noxious into something shining and precious. This brilliantly surreal imagery allows us to conceive of the medieval Virgin Mary as a kind of post-human or enhanced human subject, her body extended through artificial means to become that kind of hybrid Haraway discusses in her work on cyborg embodiment. As a proto-cyborg, the Virgin's prosthetically crystalline womb extends the category of the feminine to a mechanically advanced state, circumventing the messy, fluid conceptions of ordinary human women, carrying possibilities for thinking beyond the sexed and gendered body to alternative or post-human modes of gestation. Yet this idea of supplementation of the prosthetic extension of the body also raises some more heterodox possibilities for our interpretation of Mary's womb. As inorganic material grafted onto a human body, that lozenge of crystal within a statue, Mary's womb is a bodily prosthesis. It can therefore be understood in connection with another medieval discourse concerning bodily prostheses. So I'm drawing on an increasing volume of scholarship here, especially the work of Katie L. Walter and her colleagues in a special issue of Textual Practice, and of course the work of Caroline Dinshaw and Carmel Opry. These second two authors have drawn attention to a key passage in the early 15th century religious polemic known as the 12 Conclusions of the Lollards. In this text, the authors criticise the abuses of the medieval church. They include a reference to the disturbing activities of women religious, that's nuns, who, it was said, used inanimate objects in their sexual practices. As Dinshaw points out, this exploits the widespread medieval fascination with women's uses of sexual prostheses, which is sometimes associated with hypersexuality in general, and often with female same-sex desire or female masculinity. So Mary's inorganic, prosthetic, crystalline womb has distinct potential to arouse anxieties about embodiment, gender, and sexuality. Is it a womb perfected by being made more masculine, more crystalline, more beautiful? Or is it a prosthetic supplement that constructs Mary as a proponent of female masculinity or queer desire? It's really tempting to declare the medieval virgin as a symbol of unbounded queer potential, the product of generations of queerly infertile reproduction, who embraces the miraculous power of her masculine womb and her cyborg-like inorganic embodiment. But there's a definite undercurrent of anxiety or unease in this iconography. To explore that, I'm going to return to a text I mentioned briefly earlier on. The End Town Nativity play, probably written in the 15th century, is one of many narratives that imagine Mary's childbirth through the eyes of the apocryphal midwives who attend on the Mother of God. So this story of Mary and her midwives circulates in various forms. They're not all dramatic texts, but I've chosen to discuss a dramatic text because it brings us into contact with another kind of queer disturbance between the animate and inanimate, and it does this in a way that arouses further anxieties concerning the womb of the Virgin. The play begins with Joseph recognising his wife has just gone into labour. Deeply out of his comfort zone, he dashes off to find two experienced midwives and drags them back to the stable. But it transpires that Mary has already, suddenly, given birth and is sitting comfortably with her newborn. The sight disconcerts and worries the midwives. Instantly, they begin to question and examine their patient. Looking at mother and child, the first midwife notes that they're both totally clean. There's nothing she recognises as part of the normal mess of afterbirth and blood. There's no liquid from the womb. A fair child is born of a maiden and needs no washing as others do. And she explains that this is not just surprising but also worrying. Of this matter, I am dismayed to see them both thus undefiled. The word dismayed could be glossed as confused, but it also carries more than a hint of the modern meaning of being troubled, upset. The defilement or filth that the midwives seek would usually be understood to include the placenta, the afterbirth. If that's not present and a woman has given birth, it could indicate a medical complication. If the placenta isn't delivered after the baby is born, it's very dangerous and can lead to hemorrhage or to blood poisoning. So what the midwives see when they look at Mary is not a woman whose clean, undefiled body demonstrates her sanctity. Rather, they see a woman seemingly at risk of bleeding to death. Nor is Mary the only character on stage whose body seems disconcertingly close to being lifeless. This play, to understand this, we have to know this play is one of several English nativity plays, and the genre does not shy away at all from hinting at possibilities we might find startling or even downright irreligious. A near contemporary work known as the Second Shepherd's Play offers a strange comedy on the subject. The Virgin Mary is parodied by a shepherd's wife, whose cradle proves to contain not the newborn Christ, but rather a stolen lamb, disguised as an infant to conceal it from the angry rightful owners. The play is thick with Eucharistic jokes about the eating of the lamb. In the End Town play, a similar counterfactual alternative possibility of birth is raised when Mary's dismaying labour produces a baby which, for obvious and sound reasons of stagecraft, must in reality be a lifeless and inanimate stage prop. We know that Mary gives birth on stage in this play. There's a delightfully laconic stage direction written in Latin that tells us here, while Joseph is absent, Mary gives birth to the only begotten son. It's really fun to speculate how that moment is staged. And this is a play that often gives us really complicated and detailed stage directions. So the fact it doesn't here suggests to me that it happens pretty quickly without a lot of fuss. In some ritual drama, probably not this play, statues used for devotional purposes, like that Vierge Ouvrante at Durham, might have been pressed into service to perform this kind of moment, where an infant Christ must be produced on stage from the body of Mary. The idea of an inanimate object being quite visibly made to stand in for Christ's body would not seem wrong. But in this context, where the midwives are expressing their worries about Mary's childbirth, the inanimacy of the prop baby takes on a somewhat different meta-theatrical possibility. Why is the baby so still? Is the play going to show us an alternative narrative in which what seems to be virgin birth ends in tragedy and death? For someone familiar with the ordinary pregnant body, rather than the somewhat abstruse details of lapidary theory, the idea of a womb without fluid and blood might indeed be highly disturbing. There's nothing to nourish a fetus. The idea of a white or crystalline placenta adds to this anxiety, for the presence of white stony deposits is not unique to the imaginations of medieval visionaries. Calcified placenta is a real medical condition. The placenta becomes hardened and whitened, and if this happens prematurely, it can cause placental failure and stillbirth. It's a common complication. Midwives would, of course, be familiar with the appearance of the placenta, so one wouldn't need modern medical understanding in order to have knowledge of this condition and to worry about the appearance of a white placenta. Other aspects of the iconography we've seen are equally disturbing. Those Vierge Ouvrante statues which open down the torso recall a really grim aspect of medieval canon law. In law, if a pregnant woman died in labour, she should be cut open so that her unborn, unbaptised baby could be removed and she could be buried according to full Christian rites. And this macabre law means that the image of a bisected maternal belly might be quite a familiar aftermath of a midwife's duty. The images of the womb like a crystal pushed into the abdomen or extended to take up the entire space of the torso suggest a kind of violent dismemberment or displacement of the female body, an invasion of that space. Scholars have drawn parallels between the medieval discourse of uterine transparency and the patriarchal erasure of women. Sarah Novacek, for example, argues that the desire to see inside a woman's body, to render her transparent, can make her body seed space, whether to a fetus, to masculine divinities envisioned or inscribed within it, or to masculine discourses of science and medicine. She makes the point that this erasure of the pregnant body in favour of the fetus continues into present-day rhetoric, and we'll see in a few minutes how very much of that present-day rhetoric remains worryingly tethered to the medieval. These more disturbing aspects of the imagery of the Virgin's womb might let us read her body as queer in the uncanny sense, troubling those boundaries between living and dead in an uncomfortable or potentially uncomfortable way. The most irreproachably orthodox medieval writers, however, concur that this is a perfectly valid reading of the Virgin's womb. Over and over, Christ's gestation and birth are represented in necrotic terms. The Virgin's womb is a tight stone tomb in which Christ comes to die. Accordingly, the Virgin's crystal womb can be read as a space where warm flesh is replaced by dead mineral, its liquidity stilled and coagulated, its biological agency stopped. In effective terms, I think there's an unavoidable push and pull here between the saintly post-human miracle and the uncanny necrotic horror. Do we draw near to venerate or recoil in horror? I think this strange space between awe and horror is a space charged with emotional potential. Modern-day pejorative rhetoric still tends to categorize women without functioning wombs as improper or incomplete women. At the same time, reproductive dysfunction is often glibly presumed to be a heterosexual problem, or it's represented exclusively in terms of the losses of heterosexual women. Queer women are doubly marginalised. In the Virgin's womb, though, we glimpse the old familiar fears of pregnancy loss and pregnancy trauma, overlaid with an embodiment we could identify as queer. We can imagine, sanctified within Christian tradition, an acceptance of queer gestating bodies that fail, placentas that calcify, wombs where amniotic fluid has leaked away, pregnancies that do not end well. In this atmosphere of anxiety, the midwife's concerns are not quickly put to rest. Eventually, the first midwife completes her examinations and concludes that Mary must indeed be a virgin and a mother. But the second midwife remains doubtful. She insists, "I shall never trow it, I shall never believe it, but I prove it with hands touching, unless I test it with the touch of my hand." Implicitly, she's reaching out to touch the Virgin's genitalia, and reaching out to this intimate orifice, she exclaims with horror, her hand has been struck motionless, paralysed. "Alas, alas, and well away! My hand is dead and dry as clay." This dramatic transformation stops the midwife's hand, as it were, in mid-motion, a sudden and horrific punishment. It seems unfair. The midwife has only sought to treat her patient with the knowledge she has of the everyday pregnant body. Almost as disturbing, from a modern perspective, is the implication of anti-Semitism here. The name Salome that the midwife carries recalls the daughter of Herodotus, who caused the death of John the Baptist by demanding his head on a platter. What happens to Salome in the Endtown play is a pretty obvious echo of other medieval miracle stories in which Jewish characters who doubt Christianity or seek to profanely touch holy bodies and objects become petrified, frozen still. As Geoffrey Jerome Cohen and others have observed, medieval Christian rhetoric often represents Jewish people and Jewish history as stone-like in their anachronism. Cohen contends that Jewishness is represented as a kind of fossilized state in relation to Christian culture, a calcification of history, a survival of something that should, from an anti-Semitic Christian perspective, have been done away with once Christ was born. By this logic, Salome's punishment makes visible her status as a living anachronism, a Jewish woman who resists the progress of Christian history by refusing to recognize the virgin birth. And it's telling and apt that this lesson on the truth of virgin birth is delivered through the medium of midwifery. The term used in the medieval church for those who are unbelievers, who are heretics, is abortivi, those cast out from the womb of Mother Church. Pregnancy is then both the metaphor and the means of drawing lines between orthodoxy and heresy, faith and unbelief. But this anti-Semitism is, as everything is, complicated by undercurrents of other things. The play raises the possibility of punishment only to draw back almost immediately, and to use this scene to explore the implications of the Virgin's inorganic womb in another way. Salome is not left with her arm paralysed, dead and dry as clay. A watching angel and the Virgin herself urge Salome to touch the swaddling clothes of the infant Christ, promising she will be cured. That clothing is not the actual body of Christ. Salome stops short of direct contact with flesh. Her action performs a sort of abbreviated chiasmus. The hand that reached out to touch the Virgin's intimate flesh is turned to clay. That clay hand must touch the clothing that wraps the infant Christ. The instant she touches the swaddling clothes, her arm becomes warm human flesh, and she declares that, "In every place I shall tell this, of a clean maid God was born. And in our likeness, God now clad is, God is now clothed. Mankind to save that was forlorn, to save mankind that was lost." The metaphor of Christ clad or clothed in humanity is commonplace in medieval culture, as I've said. But in this context, it has a particular significance. The flesh that clothes Christ in humanity is, of course, the flesh of the Virgin Mary. It's through her maternal body that Christ takes on human flesh. When Salome refers to God being clad in our likeness, she's also reversing the passage from Genesis, wherein God makes human beings in his own image, in his own likeness. Salome's metaphor therefore invites us to see the transformation of her flesh that leaves her arm dead and dry as clay as an inversion or a parallel to the incarnation. In taking on mortal flesh, Christ is deadened, transformed into the clay from which God first made Adam. It's quite commonplace for medieval writers to refer to the womb as the site of Christ's imprisonment or as his tomb. It's acknowledged that taking on human flesh is part of Christ's suffering for mankind. So none of this is remarkable. But as the End Town play brackets the theology of incarnation with the discourse of Mary's inorganic womb, it exposes fault lines in that iconography of the crystalline womb. Salome's arm, transformed into clay, reminds us that all human flesh is clay. All human flesh is inorganic matter, formed in the likeness of God. Christ's incarnation is the divine putting on of mortal flesh and also the divine putting on of clay. The anxiety of the medieval church concerning the flesh of Christ and the flesh of Mary, which is what gave us this imagery of crystal and stone, is really only recalcifying what is already clay. This recursive process of imagining Mary's body made inorganic and still more inorganic reflects an anxious desire to erase the flesh, to transform and retransform it into mineral. Writing the flesh out of the incarnational narrative is a self-defeating gesture, a collapse of logic rooted in that anxiety about the bleeding, fluid gestational body that I discussed at the very beginning of this talk. This misogynistic and anti-Semitic twist on the nativity story uses the figure of Salome as a sort of safety valve concerning anxieties about the Virgin's womb. She's punished for her uncertainty or disbelief of its true nature. But the play also exposes the underlying problem with that iconography of the Virgin's womb. And this problem is that its construction of an inorganic, post-human, perfected crystalline womb is rooted in desire to write flesh and blood out of the narrative of gestation. This emerges as not merely misogynistic, but also redundant. All the strenuous imagining of Mary's womb as crystal and stone or that literalizing of metaphors of her inorganic body. And we cannot escape the fundamental fact that all human flesh is clay and all Christ's flesh is human. I'd like to suggest that the iconography of Mary's crystalline womb represents a kind of queer failure, or maybe a queer excess. It's that failure Halberstam describes, which is creative, transformative, emotionally engaging. The vision of Mary's womb as gleaming white or gilded does, in the event, nothing very useful for the theology of the incarnation. It raises more problems than it solves. But its sheer strangeness pushes us, challenges us. It offers new possibilities for imagining embodiment and for picturing the kind of queer emotion that the Mother of God might generate as she performs such strange gestation. That's my paper proper. What I want to offer now is something in the nature of a postscript to draw these ideas into much more recent history. The iconography of the Virgin's crystalline womb casts a surprisingly long shadow over contemporary research into pregnancy. In 1981, writing in the Journal of American Medical Association, Dr. Michael Harrison explained that the fetus had, until recently, been a recluse in an opaque womb, and it was not until the last half of this century that the prying eye of the ultrasonogram rendered that once opaque womb transparent, stripping the veil of mystery from the dark inner sanctum and letting the light of scientific observation fall. This is a much quoted passage in studies of fetal subjectivity and of recent pregnancy discourse. It's delightfully high-flown rhetoric, quite obviously. The image Harrison is evoking is that of the Annunciation, the Incarnation, the moment at which the light of God penetrates the womb of the Virgin and discloses within her the presence of Christ. It's therefore connected in a sort of umbilical, tethered way to that other iconography of the Virgin's transparent womb, as we see it in the wider medieval tradition. And I love the fact that here, the light of scientific observation, or possibly the eyes of the doctor, take on the role of God. Ultrasound technology continues to be caught up, rhetorically speaking, with Christian iconography. It feeds into anti-abortion rhetoric. Christian anti-abortion groups have made ultrasound images very central to their message. Ultrasound enables us to view the fetus without viewing the mother. We can zoom in on an image and the maternal body becomes transparent. Much like the Vierge ouvrante, whose interior anatomy is erased, the woman in the ultrasound picture becomes mere empty space in which the fetus floats, seemingly independent. And there's a lot of research into the way that this discourse is constructed, some of which I put in the bibliography on this handout. Anti-abortion rhetoric erases the body around the womb. It requires that womb to behave as an inorganic vessel rather than part of a living body. We hear claims that the body can shut down pregnancy in the case of rape. We hear a bill proposed for US law that requires the re-implantation of an ectopic pregnancy back into the womb, as if an interconnected system of flesh and blood can be simply clicked out of place and slotted back elsewhere. It's not a biological possibility. Yet the discourse of the inorganic womb is not only the domain of those who would seek to make all women emulate the Virgin Mary. There's a brilliant ongoing medical research project that's been developing and testing artificial wombs using sheep fetuses. It's a trial that's been fairly prominently reported in popular as well as scientific literature. You can look it up, I've put the links on the handout. Fetal lambs are gestated first in the womb, the ordinary womb, and then while they're still very premature, they're transferred into liquid-filled sacks, which the researchers have called a biobag. And the application for this research would, of course, be to extend the survival chances of very premature babies. In popular reports of the research, this is represented as highly futuristic technology, the stuff of post-human fantasy or nightmare. The emphasis, unanimously, is on the material form from which the biobag is made, on the fact that it is plastic. In popular imagination, what's important is the vessel, the inorganic substance. This is a really telling misconception. Publishing their research, the creators of the biobag emphasise that the most important aspect of their creation is that it's a system of moving fluid parts. It enables fluid transfer. It is a closer imitation of the flesh and blood womb than any previous incubator. Medieval visionaries made the Lamb of God gestate in a transparent and artificial womb, as unlike human flesh as possible. Medical researchers now make ovine fetuses gestate in transparent and artificial wombs, as like to human flesh as possible. These developments in medical technology and social rhetoric will probably continue to intersect and entangle, as the womb remains a battleground both for those who would seek to erase the living flesh around it, and for those who hope to supplement or replace that flesh when it fails. Like the medieval virgin's queer womb, this is a site of controversies and contradictions. What may seem to be a transcendence of the human is all too easily pressed into service as the rhetorical means of reducing women's bodies to objects. But my hope is that the long history of the womb offers some means of recalibrating these debates, seeing where they came from, bringing them into perspective. So to conclude, the medieval iconography of the Virgin's womb is rooted in a misogynistic fear about the female body as disgusting, something that would be better if only it were more solid, more contained, more masculine, and more transparently visible to masculine eyes. This inorganic womb also becomes available as a punitive exemplar, used to transform a medieval woman's body into clay, or to require of a modern woman's body a plasticity she cannot sustain. Yet the enduring construction of the womb as an inorganic substance has the capacity to spark remarkable queer possibilities. It allows us to reclaim the Virgin Mary as a sympathetic model for those of us with bodies that do not or cannot conceive, gestate or give birth in accordance with the dictates of biology textbooks. It urges us to think, too, about what is at stake in imagining the post-human womb, the post-human body, and leaving behind the flesh. Thank you very much.